Captain Lydia Voss boards a giant alien breeding vessel in search of answers, and what she uncovers is that the Vorthok aren't trying to invade Earth. They're converting humanity into hybrids who have the intelligence of humans and the biology of aliens. She blows up the facility with quantum charges, annihilating the immediate threat, but discovers that additional conversion ships are already on their way to Earth, establishing humanity's battle to survive against a foe who comes not with death, but transcendence. Captain Lydia Voss wiggled her back to the cold and steely sides of the shaft walls, grateful she couldn't feel the steady pounding of her heart against her ribs as the chittering expanded below. The alien voices were using no language she understood, but she got the gist well enough. They knew something was wrong. 3 days she'd been hanging on the outside of the monstrous breeding vessel in silent observance, but today she had graduated into her newfound hiding place, and everything was ticking along with a speed that made her even more paranoid still. Briefing mission had come in at the highest level of secrecy. There were only a dozen human beings on the face of the Earth who actually knew what was going on out here in the voids between Jupiter and Saturn. The Kepler Deep Space Array had picked up the ship's signals 18 months prior, but it had been a year before they were able to break the code running off its hull. And when the xenolinguists finally decoded the alien communications, it was even worse than anyone could have imagined. The ship was more than a ship. It was a factory, a breeding ground, and Earth was the target. Lydia had signed on for the quest before anyone had completed reading the mission briefing. Her rivals in the Special Operations Command were still debating the idea of a one-man infiltration, but she already was analyzing the ship's energy profile and plotting her approach. She'd become known as the fleet's finest deep space operator, but that strength would be measured at every level on this deployment. Despite the skills she'd honed over more than a decade and a half of service, the breeding ship was a huge thing, about the size of Manhattan, and it had organic curves that made it look as if it had been grown rather than constructed. The rude pulses of sickly green light which coursed through its hull reminded Lydia of infected flesh. The closer she got during her 3-day recon, the more she discerned it wasn't merely transporting the Vorthok, an alien race, it was manufacturing them. In the intercepted transmissions, the ship was carrying over 2 million Vorthok young. In all stages of growth, the adult population didn't count for as many, perhaps 50,000, but they were the controllers, the ones making the decisions, the ones who had made Earth their next conquest. The 2 actions which Lydia had commanded were not impossible of conception, but they were mortal of consequence. And she has to use a string of quantum charges to blow up the breeding chambers and initiate a bake-off to vaporize the whole ship and everything in it. These charges were intended to disrupt the organic structure of the ship on a molecular level, leaving nothing alive after the explosion. No lifeboats, no survivors, no way out that let anything other than the entire mission fail. First, though, she had to reach the breeding chambers and plow her way through a ship full of adversaries who regarded humans in no other light than as raw material in their quest for expansion. The chittering subsided below, so Lydia allowed herself to breathe once more. Turning her gaze on the grating that lay below her feet, she checked to make sure the corridor was cleared. The Vorthok had departed, no doubt to inspect other parts of the ship. She had 10 minutes at most before they came back. She unscrewed the grating and dropped onto the corridor floor as quietly as possible. The walls here were not the same she had seen in the outside areas she infiltrated. These surfaces were warm and somewhat yielding in place of cold metal, reminiscent of cartilage. The air was heavy with humidity, and scented with an overripe sweetish stench, reminiscent of the scent of overripe fruit mixed with something medicinal. She was approaching the breeding chambers. Lydia brought up her tactical screen, a thin film, lying over her left eye that mapped the interior layout of the ship in real time. The quantum scanner she had welded to the hull when it began its journey still worked and built up a three-dimensional map of the ship. The breeding chambers had been concentrated in the heart of the ship, shielded by layer upon layer of defensive systems and home to the greatest concentration of adult VOR, THAKS. By her figures, she would have had to put charges in a minimum of 12 places to guarantee the foundation was completely ruined. The quantum explosives were not large. They were each about the size of a marble, but they were the most powerful weapons humanity had ever developed. One blast could take out a whole city block. 12 mines, all fired at the same time, would split this ship like an egg. The way up ahead branched out into 3 routes. Lydia checked her display, then took the course to further inside the ship. As she took steps, she saw the walls growing more organic, with veins showing through, pulsing through the walls. The bioluminescent glow was sharper here. Everything washed in an eerie green from which shadows danced in her peripheral vision. She had been walking perhaps 5 minutes when she heard it, a noise that put her to a halt, and her reach to the plasma on her back. It was singing, not the chittering banter she'd become so accustomed to, but the sound of singing. Melodic, haunting, and unmistakably human. The sound led Lydia to the cusp of an expansive room, whose limits exceeded the sight of her augmented vision. The walls swept up to disappear into blackness, and the floor was cushiony and uncomfortably warm underfoot. But it was the contents of the center of the chamber that took Sansa's breath away. Pods, hundreds and hundreds of them, perfectly lined up in rows that extended as far as she could see. Each pod was about the size of person. It was translucent, filled with a green solution that emitted the same bioluminescent glow as the hull of the ship. And at the center of each one hung a human, floating like a specimen in a laboratory. The singing was emanating from one of the pods in the front row. A woman, probably 30, her hair dark and floating about her face like seaweed. Her eyes were closed, her lips were moving, and words were traveling through the chamber with impossible clarity. Lydia knelt and activated her scanner, her hands trembling. The readings were like nothing else she had ever seen. She was alive inside, but her biology had changed in ways that seemed inexplicable. Her brain activity was through the roof, her cellular biology was being rewritten, and her genetic code was being rewritten in an orderly manner. It was from turning the woman into something else, something that was part human and part Vorthok. Lydia gasped when the woman's eyes opened, and those pupils had been replaced by the same glowing green as the ship's hull. She stared at Lydia and simply smiled. Her lips moved, and Lydia could make out her words despite the fluid he was in. "You are too late," the woman said, her voice full of a harmonic that pained to the marrow in Lydia's bones. "The first wave departs in 6 hours. When the transformation is finished, the earth will be beautiful." Lydia felt herself reel backward. In shock, this was no mere breeding ship. It was a conversion facility. The Vorthok did not have any intention to invade Earth themselves. They intended to make the human race their army. She switched her comm system on, attempted to reach the fleet, and found the signal blocked by the ship's living hull. She was completely alone, all the converted DM's agents and the unknown number of Vorthok aside, with the weight of her entire species borne only by her slim shoulders. The woman in the pod grinned on, her new eyes following Lydia's approach. "You can accompany us." Her voice began to take on the chittering undertones that the Vorthok used in their communications. The process is painless. And then it's going to be over, and you're going to know why that was done. Lydia tore her eyes from the pod and concentrated on her mission. There was no choice. She had to lay the charges, had to destroy the ship and stop the invasion fleet from making it to Earth. But now she understood that the war of invasion was not a war of conquest alone. It was about transformation, about transmuting humanity into something else altogether. Entering the chamber further, she started to gauge the enormity of the entire operation. The pods fanned out in all directions, set in an orderly geometric formation, a symmetry that hinted at an organization that was distinctly, well, mathematical. In each pod was a human at a different point of change, some still looking like humans, while others had developed the true insectile chitin and compound eyes of the Vorthak. As she walked, Lydia started to detect patterns in the layout. The pods were clustered together according to their similarity and corresponded to different steps of conversion. The more recent-made vampires were at the middle, and the ones made long before encircled them in ever-widening circles. And at the heart of the chamber, on a platform that glowed with its own light, stood a single pod larger than all the rest. The figure inside had Lydia's blood run cold. The thing inside the middle pod towered over them with 8 feet or so of feral rage, sporting 4 arms each with a claw that could probably slice metal. It had a longish head covered in the same chitinous plating as the other Vorthok, but its eyes were wrong. But instead of the dense array of compound eyes of the adult aliens, this one had human eyes glowing with an intelligence that was at once alien and familiar. This was the converted file, not a new kind of human, but a hybrid, an abomination that was part human intelligence, part Vorthok biology. A leader of the invasion force, Lydia knew that she was seeing what she would allow the future of humanity to become if she failed. We'd have the whole of Earth to plunder after everyone was converted like this one and used as soldiers for the Vorthok wars throughout the galaxy. She grasped for the initial quantum charge, her fingers steady in spite of what she was seeing. The charge was small and sleek, rather like a miniature airplane grey box, and its arming sequence was easy to follow and would prime it for remote detonation. She folded it down carefully next to the base of the central pod, where it would have the most effect on the surrounding conversion chambers as she set the charge. The thing inside the pod opened its eyes and stared right at her. Its eyes were intelligent, calculating, and brimmed with a malignant awareness that made Lydia's skin crawl. You can't prevent what has already started. The creature's voice echoed in a mixture of human resonance and the chittering harmonics of the Vorthok. The transformation ships are on the way. There will be Earth changes, regardless of whether this facility is part of the solution or not. Lydia did not listen to the creature's words, but went on to the next site, dropping homes in easy stages all about the cavern. They had all been placed to cause the maximum amount of destruction to the conversion machinery, and there would be no chance that any of the mutated humans would survive such an explosion as she worked. She started hearing more voices from the pods around her. The transformed humans were beginning to awaken, and so were their changed senses, which were starting to pick up her presence. They called out to her, their human words mixed with alien harmonics in a chorus that was beautiful and terrifying. Come with us, they almost sang, and the counterpoint of their words wove a complicated musical tune which seemed to slip by her intellect and strike in the deepest part of her feelings. The universe is large and lonely. We offer connection. We offer purpose. We offer immortality. Lydia's willpower began to crack as she listened to the voices incessantly begging her. Something seductive about their offer. Something that touched on the well of profound loneliness that had led her to volunteer for this suicide mission in the first place. She had no family waiting for her on Earth, no relationships that would be dashed by her death. Her entire life had been a life of service, of protecting mankind from threats that most wouldn't believe existed. But as she observed the converted people around her, she saw what they offered wasn't truly life. It was absorption. The annihilation of individual identity into the Bermensch, the beyond being, that is, in the end, an alien being. They weren't human, no matter how much they might remember of their human past. The 8th went down and she was off, her tactical display showing her as being almost a quarter way to where her goal lay. She had planted charges along the rest of the chamber to ensure complete leveling of the conversion chamber, but in order to be certain the entire ship was destroyed, she still had to reach each of the other breeding chambers. As she neared the back of the chamber, Lydia caught a faint sound and she stopped dead in her tracks. The sound of adult Vorthok chittered, though way too close for comfort. They were in the chamber with her, gliding through the ranks of pods with the flowing ease of top predators. She hunkered down behind one of the larger pods and turned on her stealth system, an ethereal field generator which bent light around her physical body to grant her a degree of invisibility. The system wasn't foolproof, but it would give her time if she didn't try to rush through it. 3 grown Vorthok were making their way across the chamber outside. The translucent walls of the pod, they were larger than she'd realized. Each one was close to 7 feet tall, and their gangly limbs terminated in sharp claws. Their heads were dominated by compound eyes that glowed with the same green light as the hull of their ship, and they made a constant chittering noise that was a mix between insect communications and electronic static. The Vorthok were crawling over the pods, scratching claws across the transparent surfaces in organized patterns that indicated they were doing some sort of examination. As they shuffled forward, Lydia understood they were not just inspecting the converted humans, they were harvesting them. A pod housing a human that was nearly finished processing was attended to by one of the creatures. Inside of it, the person had taken on the chitinous exoskeleton and compound eyes of the Vorthok. But there were enough human features present to at least allow her to be recognized as female. The Vorthok fiddled with a set of pipes on the base of the pod, and the green fluid contracted down. Once the fluid drained and the human inside began to stir, her alien compound eyes focused on the world outside the pod. The Vorthok chattered at her in its alien tongue, and she replied in kind, her voice. The same combination of the music in her voice she heard on the others that had been turned. The transformation was complete. The woman was no longer human, not exactly Vorthok either. She was fresh and clean, a melding of their 2 species in the best possible way, and she was being roused as a soldier to invade Earth. Lydia watched in terror as the hybrid emerged from the pod, moving smoothly and gracefully despite the newness of her hybrid form. The Vorthok chirruped at her once more, and she nodded, then went to that far end of the chamber, and this was how the invasion would go. The Vorthok was converting humans into hybrids, forming an army with human brains but alien bodies. The hybrids were to be utilized to penetrate Earth's defenses, give the conversion process to the people, and guarantee there would be no resistance. Lydia knew she was witnessing the creation of a new name, one that would usurp humanity altogether if things went south with her. Mission. When the Vorthok had moved forward to other pods, she resumed her work. The 9th device was next to a pack of birthing pods, Elaine's in the early stages of metamorphosis. The 10th killed the controls for the conversion machinery. The 11th was mounted at the base of the platform containing the central pod. Lydia reached for the 12th and last explosive she was to lay when she heard steps behind her. She whirled face to face with the new hybrid risen from the pod. Up close, the creature was even more unsettling, its human features distorted from the alien alterations to its body. "You do not know what you do," the hybrid continued with the same rattling musical voice. "This isn't an invasion. It's an evolution. Humanity is flawed, limited, mortal. We offer perfection." Lydia aimed her plasma rifle, but the hybrid did not advance, but instead was dead still as beams of green light glistened off her compound eyes in the chamber while she continued verbalizing. "I recall what it was like when I was human," purred the hybrid in a voice that held, possibly, an echo of something that could almost have been pity. "I still remember the loneliness, the fear, the never-ending battle against a merciless universe that wouldn't stop trying to take everything I loved. The Vorthok taught me a different way. They demonstrated connection, purpose, meaning. Never were human, were you?" Lydia asked, her finger moving closer to the trigger. "You're something else. Something that wants to annihilate everything about our species that is human." The hybrid tilted her head. The patterns of her compound eyes were analyzing Lydia with an intensity that was strange and uncomfortably familiar. "Is that what you think? That we're out to abolish humanity? We want to perfect it so as to equip it to survive in a universe inimical to organic life by turning us into insects?" "By making us better," the hybrid had answered. "Something that could live in the vacuum of space between stars. Something that could survive in any environment. Something that could live for thousands of years without aging, without dying. Something that can crawl its way across the galaxy. Impose order upon the chaos of biological existence." Lydia shivered as she realized what the hybrid was talking about. Here, it was not only a matter of conquest or of conversion. It would be about transformation on a scale that would redefine what it meant to be human. "The universe is so very large and so very empty," the hybrid went on, her voice growing thick and dull like molasses as Lydia's sight started to fuzz over at the edges. "There is a population of humanity all on one planet, which is the native tribe occupied by colonists, trying to have wars and win pieces of territory that will last for a couple of generations. We provide expansion, exploration, the opportunity to be something more than the sum of biological limits." Lydia forced herself to concentrate on the mission, on the charges she'd planted all around the chamber, on the remote detonator in her palm. But the hybrid's words were working their magic, sowing doubt in a place where there used to be only certainty, seeding questions where there were once only answers. "What happens to free will?" Lydia inquired in a voice that was just above. A whisper. "What happens to love, to art, to everything that makes us human?" The hybrid smiled. The modification on her face combined beauty and beastly. "Those things become part of a bigger thing. Love is the connection to all life. Art is the invention of new modes of existence. Free will turns from freedom to violate the laws of nature to the freedom to lift ourselves out of our biological dispositions. And what if someone doesn't want to be transcended?" The hybrid's expression became neutral, her compound eyes a depthless chill that was entirely alien. "Then they choose extinction. For them and for their kind." Lydia discovered that she beheld the future of mankind should the transplant be successful. Not death, exactly, but an exchange into something that had held onto some human features. While being relentlessly alien, she had once been human, the hybrid in front of her. But she no longer understood why anyone would want to stay human. The first wave of launches is in 4 hours, the hybrid said as her voice took on its mesmeric rhythm again. 12 ships, 50,000 hybrids in each of them. They will land on the Earth and start converting things. In 6 months' time, every human being in the world will have changed. In 1 year, we will make Earth a staging ground for the expansion into the 24 galaxies. 4 hours. That was fewer hours than Lydia had estimated. The invasion was accelerating. She triggered the remote detonator, holding her hand over the button that would obfuscate just as much of our chamber and all us who then stood within it. But the hybrid didn't try to stop her. "You can blow up this place," the hybrid replied, with a finality that froze his blood, her human voice as distant as an echo. "You might kill the 2 million grubs and the 50,000 flies on this ship, but you can't halt a thing that has started." It was a tried and true conversion. The invasion armadas are on their way. Earth's transformation is inevitable. The failure was pressing in on Lydia. Even if she managed to blow the breeding ship, it would serve only to stall the invasion, not stop it. The Vorthok had other ships, other facilities, other designs, but delay might be enough. If buying Earth time was what she could do, then maybe the fleet could ready better defenses. Perhaps the scientists could find countermeasures. Perhaps humanity could somehow endure without being turned into something foreign. Perhaps. She replied with a calm steadiness that belied the fear and doubt that struggled to consume her. But maybe is better than giving up. She pressed the trigger. It was initiated in the middle of the room, with the quantum charge she had planted beneath the central pod, and quickly raced outward at the speed of light. Before the hybrid had a chance to express her shocked jaws, the cascade of energy obliterated her form. Breaking her down to her atomic level, the detonations went off in chain sequence, each feeding the next till a cascade of energy was spreading all through the chamber. The conversion pods exploded, gushing their contents and mingling it with the quantum fire that was destroying everything it touched. But Lydia wasn't finished. She needed to get to the other breeding chambers. She needed to ensure the whole ship was obliterated. She managed to keep ahead of the collapsing passageways as explosions started weakening them, and she raced down them, her enhanced body working over time to move faster than a human body should have been able to. The ship was collapsing around her. The biological walls were sealing up. The bioluminescent light was dimming, and the air filled with the acrid stench of burning wet meat. But she could still hear the chittering of the Vorthok, still feel their presence throughout the ship. She got to the second breeding chamber, which was a mess. The adult Vorthok were attempting to evacuate the larvae, placing them into escape pods that were shooting out from the vessel. But there were too many larvae, and not nearly enough pods. The next generation would die with the ship. Lydia buried those that remained at her disposal in the rest of the chamber with an automaton's efficiency in the chaos that surrounded her. The Vorthok took notice of her, and she saw him start to close in on her, and their chittering chatter sounded like anger and madness as she set off the charges and fled with the detonations chasing after her toward the outer hull of the ship. The channel through which she had entered the ship was crumbling, but this was to be expected. The escape pod she'd hidden aboard the exterior of the ship was still operational, still able to steer her away from the ship before the quantum charges blew it apart. As she was launched up towards the exterior hull, Lydia got a good look at the massive amount of damage she had done. The ship was collapsing, and the mechanical skin of the ship's body was unable to hold the quantum fire that was consuming it. Escape pods were spewing in every direction, leading some Vorthok to safety aboard smaller craft. But the bulk of the ship's population was stuck. She jumped into her escape pod and turned on the switch, the small ship pinging off the decaying hull and shooing away from the growing cloud of wreckage. The breeding ship crumbled slowly behind her, the hull breaking open along its natural fissures. But as Lydia watched the ship's death throes, she understood that her mission had been a success and a failure. She had blown up the egg factory and saved Earth from imminent invasion. But she'd also discovered that the threat was far worse than anyone had thought. The Vorthok had other ships, other refineries, other plans. Her cum system sprang to life. Once she passed out of the ship's interference field, it was Admiral Peterson, her superior, and one of the only people aware of what she was doing. "Voss, what's going on?" Peterson's voice was strained. "We're reading extremely heavy energy." "Readings where you are." "Mission complete," Lydia's tired voice reported in. "The breeding ship is destroyed." "But we've got a problem, Admiral. The invasion is bigger than we thought." This was just one facility. There are others. How many others? Lydia looked around at the burned-out remains of the Brooder ship and pondered the hybrid's words about the other 12 ships now on their way to Earth. "I don't know, but we have to expect the worst. The Vorthok don't just intend to invade. They're out to transform humanity into something else entirely." The cum line was silent for several moments before Peterson answered. "Understood. Return to base immediately. We need to receive briefings and have our defenses ready." Lydia steered toward Earth, and she couldn't stop thinking about the hybrid's proposition. The lure of transcendence, of being something other than human, of joining a collective that spread across the galaxy. There had been something alluring about it, something that spoke the woman disconnected by birth from normal human society. But she had made her choice. She'd chosen to be human, with the limitations and stumbles that brought. She'd decided to fight for a race that was flawed, mortal, and alone in a seething universe of enemies. The question was whether that choice would be sufficient to save humanity from the transformation that was coming. The breeding ship had been defeated, but the invasion was on the way. And when it came, humanity would have to choose between the struggle for their biological inheritance and the promise of transcendence that the Vorthok were promising. Lydia powered on her long-range comms array and sent a message. The fleet had to know what was coming, had to prep for an enemy who did not want to wipe out humanity, but to change it into something other. The battle for the future of humankind was on, and the first victory had been achieved. But the real battle was only beginning, and the stakes have never been higher. The very survival of the consciousness of humanity, of human cultural values, human identities, depended on the result. With Earth swelling on her view screen, Lydia Voss, psyching herself for the most important briefing of her life. The survival of her entire race rested on the fact that she could convince the fleet that sometimes the biggest threat is not extinction, and some of the worst damage comes not from being rebuffed, but from the prospect of something better. The escape pod's engines buzzed a monotonous hymn to her as it bore the diminutive ship toward home, and toward a world that was yet unaware of how narrowly it had skirted losing all that made it human. Behind her, the garbage heap that was the breeding ship spread, carrying 2 million larvae and 50,000 adults that had only wished to impart their version of perfection on the galaxy. But perfection, Lydia had come to know, was nothing more than another word for the end of all that made life lovely, and some things were worth fighting for, even when the fight appeared unwinnable. Up ahead, the stars shimmered with the cold light of distant suns, each a testimony of how cold and empty the universe really was. But somewhere deep in that immensity, humanity had found a home, a way to survive, to flourish, to make sense of things. Despite the yawning indifference of the universe, as long as there were people like Lydia Voss who were willing to fight for it, who sacrificed everything in order to keep that meaning, who became the thing that made them human, there was hope that humanity would continue to shine against the black of space. The invasion was coming. The conversion ships were on their way. But mankind had been put on its guard, and that warning could just be enough to turn the tide in the war for the soul of the human race, Captain. Lydia Voss had done her duty. Now it was other humans' turn to do theirs.